Your obsession with right and wrong is preventing you from understanding cause and effect. GariTalks. That is something that I'm working on. I created a post. I wanted to write it on Instagram, but I'm having some trouble writing it out exactly. What I mean by that, right? We tend to be really obsessed with good and bad, right and wrong, constantly. That's like what we're grappling with often, it feels, right? Is this a good thing to say? Is this the right way to do this? Is this the right thing? Da 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 da. I personally feel like that really detracts from action, being able to do things, and then just assessing the consequences of that thing. That's like when we're talking in that way. A lot of the other times too, we're talking about if something has already happened in the past, we're trying to figure out if this person wronged us, they did a good thing or a bad thing, etc., etc., versus being able to assess the impact, right, and the consequences of what that person has done. Right? Oh, you should have never done that. I mean, but we did. So can we deal with here now, right? And I'm thinking about this. This came to me when I thought about a lot of in regards to like slavery, right? People being like, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Like, that's a stupid conversation to even have, right? And I don't really like using the word stupid because it's definitely a judgment, but like I think that's really dumb because inherently I would want to say that was just a bad thing, right? I think we can, I feel like I wish we could just agree on that, right? But however, even if we can't, we can talk about the consequences that it still has today in the Caribbean, in America, in the world. It has left an imprint on our society, right? And that's what we need to talk about. But if we're sitting here talking about good and bad, it's real shitty and stupid. It's also really important to think about who defined these things as good and bad. Usually it was the church defining if things were good and bad, who was going to hell and who was not. But who was the one mandating the crusades? Right? Who was the person who actually created the concept of hell and damning people to it? Right? Who still protects people who molest children? Right? We got to be very clear about who is defining good and bad. Okay? That's first and foremost. And that's why I think that whole concept just needs to get put the fuck out so that we can start focusing on cause and effect. Something that is bringing me to this conversation too is thinking about this word manipulate. I feel like when we hear the word manipulate, for me at least, it brings up feelings like, ooh, like that. That's how I usually feel about it when I hear that word, right? It makes me think there's another word, sinister, that makes me feel like, ooh, back of the neck tingles, like somebody reaching for me at the base of my spine or base of my nape. And it's funny, right? Because sinister, just a little nerd moment for you, means the word left, comes from the word for left in Latin. Um, and if we're thinking about right hand path, left hand path, the right hand path is that of light and love of God and authoritarianism. The left hand path is considered the path of individualism and, veering away from God and figuring things out for yourself. So that's just interesting to think about those associations. But when it comes to the word manipulate, I looked it up, right? It means to handle or control, typically in a skillful manner. That's the first one. Right? If you manipulate, I guess another word is like maneuver, but he manipulated the car in a very skillful way, right? People don't usually use it in that way. The connotation is to control or influence cleverly, unfairly, or unscrupulously. What a great word. It comes from the word manus, meaning hands, and plere, or the root of plere, to fill. So to fill by hand. Interesting, right? When I think about influence, influence is to flow into, right? So manipulate is to move by hand, to fill by hand, and influence is to flow into. So there's this very big idea of you putting a thing onto somebody, right? And I think we tend to focus on the very negative aspects of manipulation. So the fear, obligation, and guilt that comes out of it. Like being manipulated by, by what are some options for us, like to vote, right? And being manipulated by the media to believe that the world is a really scary, dangerous, fucked up place. There's manipulation in like domestic abuse, or just like in not only domestic abuse, but just like unhealthy couplings of people, right? So there's verbal abuse when you're like berating people, right? That's just That's just usually if you're yelling at somebody to do something, right? There's a form of manipulation there. Withholding information, right? So if you're not being forthcoming about something and you're lying about something so that somebody, so for instance, if you had sex without a condom, but you didn't tell your partner because you want them to continue to have sex with you, that is manipulation, right? Because you're not being honest. Right? Or if you went to go see somebody, but you knew that your partner would prefer you not to see them, but then you just didn't tell them that and you like talked around it, that is manipulation, right? Because you're bending the truth so that the other person will still respond to you in a particular way. Using sex as gain to gain things, that is manipulation. You're leveraging sex and a connection through intimacy, physical intimacy to get a thing. Threatening people, that's straight up just like coercion, right? Like, if you don't do this, I'll do this. That's, or I'll hurt you, or, you know, or I'll leave you, or anything like that. There's also passive aggressive behavior, right? Which is when you're not being direct about what you're saying, but you're trying to get somebody to do something and you're hoping that they'll read into what you're talking about, right? There's also two ways to go about it, right? There's the bully method, which is straight up aggression, like maybe the one who's very like aggressive and threatening and like in your face about controlling. Then there's the victim, which is sometimes harder to identify, but this like playing like, oh my god, you know, you never stay with me and you always go out and I'm always by myself and I have nobody and, you know, you're leaving me too. That's like the victim kind of way, right? So it comes from a place of powerlessness, of helplessness. And it's very much wrapped up in coercion, right? Which is like doing something that you don't want to do for somebody else's gain, for the person who's doing its gain, right? But something I've been thinking about is there such thing as good manipulation? First of all, we need to understand, feel by hand, we are always doing that. We are always manipulating things and people around us. We manipulate this reality, right? Like, I have manipulated this room. I literally filled it by hand and moved things around, right? Thinking about being like, eat more vegetables, right? Telling people that you need to eat more vegetables, lower your sugar intake, da-da-da-da-da. Quit smoking, right? Do this shadow work. Right? You need to do shadow work if you want to attain your better self. You need to heal yourself. Is that not forms of manipulation? Obviously, it doesn't have the connotation that it usually has, but is that not manipulation? Right? Getting people to think better of themselves. Motivating people. Wouldn't that be manipulation? If somebody's convicted in this thinking poorly about themselves and you're trying to tell them to think otherwise, is that not manipulation? Right? Getting people to take your advice. Is that not manipulation? Telling people about a particular thing that you would like for them to try to incorporate into their routine. Is that not manipulation? You know what I'm saying? Something that I know I do that is considered manipulation in what I consider is I ask people, what is something that made you smile today? Or what is something that you learned this week? Right? Because I'm getting them to think about something that they may or may not have thought about. Maybe that they didn't even want to think about. This one man, I asked him what made him smile today. He said nothing. I was like, all right, cool. What made you scowl? And he ended up telling me some stuff that made him smile and also just telling me a little bit about him, right? And so I bring this up to say, when we're focused on good and bad, it really deters us from being able to see the effects of things, right? So if we were to look at manipulate, not based on if it's a good or bad thing to do, but to look at it as like, what are the consequences of that? What are the effects? What are the results that are coming out of that kind of action? Then we can determine if this was a harmful or helpful, if it was optimal or destructive, right? Like, and then from there we can make more decisions versus trying to determine if something's good or bad all the time. I just feel like it's very, very, very annoying because it's so subjective what good and bad is, you know? Because what I think is good may not be what you think is good. What I think is bad may not be what you think is bad, but we can talk about consequences. We can talk about how this impacted us. We can talk about, you know, what led to this thing happening versus trying to decipher the best or worst way to do something. And I think about when we're talking about personal development, like, is this the right way to say this? Is this the best thing to do and say and think and whatever? When you get caught up in that limbo of trying to figure it out, I find it really challenging to then actually be able to assess anything because you're not doing anything, right? You're paralyzed by the analysis paralysis. You're trying to figure out the best move. Is this right or wrong versus doing things and then being able to figure it out what to tweak. Okay, maybe that was not a good move. Let's not do that, right? Not a good move, right? Let's cut out good. Maybe this move did not serve me in the way that I thought it would. I learned something, or this move was just straight up harmful. And actually it was pointless. I didn't do anything. It was aimless. Then we can tweak it, do a different thing, right? So, point of this video is basically, let's get rid of good and bad, right and wrong, y'all, so that we can actually just talk about cause and effect. We can talk about consequences. We can talk about what happens when people do things, right? If you push me and now I don't want to be your friend no more, it's not because you pushing me is a good or bad thing. It is us now talking about boundaries. What are my physical boundaries here? I don't like that you did that to me. This impacted our relationship. And then we can kind of address from there. You know what I'm saying? Instead of getting caught up in the good and bad piece of it. I just feel like that portion of it just doesn't really, for me, doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't feel like there's a necessary reason to categorize things in good and bad and right and wrong versus talking about harmful and talking about helpful. And we can obviously lump it into harmful as bad, but that is not true. Right? That's not always true. The things that we think are bad are not always harmful for us. It depends, again, on who's defining good or bad. Because based on, for instance, like protesting, right? I feel like the government would say that's bad. Or some people might say that's bad. But it's not an inherently good or bad thing. It is a thing that has consequences. You get what I'm saying? So that's all I got for you. Thanks for listening. I kind of wrote this one out, but it was also just in the head. So love to hear your thoughts on that. What are some examples that you have of positive and negative manipulation? And when I say positive and negative, before I go, I feel like I've said this before, but I'll say it again. When I think of positive, I think of adding towards, and negative, I think of taking away from. Right? So not good and bad. But if we're talking literal numbers, positive is to have. If we're talking about the number line, it's on the have side and then the have not side. And I think about the example often of like, if I want to go to work early tomorrow, something that would be positive would be going to sleep early, laying out my clothes the night before, preparing my lunch before, maybe having breakfast laid out, things that add to me being able to get there on time. Negative would be things that take away, right? Like turning up the night before, getting drunk the night before, going to sleep really late, not setting an alarm. These are negative things because they take away from the goal of getting there early. You get what I'm saying? So that's what I mean by positive, negative. And this is when I mean we got to stop talking about good and bad, but talk about consequences. Talk about cause and effect. So that's me.